below, a very contradictory and paradoxical symbolism, but nevertheless symbolic of the movement from below, had been president of Brazil for 2 years. The reception he got just a few days earlier was much more mixed and much more ambiguous. In a sense, what had happened in that January of 2005 was that two avenues, two directions seemed to be emerging now in the course of the movement in Latin America, a process which really, we could argue, had begun simultaneously and in parallel with Seattle in Cochabamba, Bolivia, which is generally seen to mark the beginning of the fight back, the beginning of the emergence of a new movement of resistance in Latin America. By 2005, we in our debates here at Marxism and elsewhere were acknowledging that the resistance to imperialism, the resistance to globalization across the world was being conducted and developing on 3 fronts. And one of those fronts was Latin America. In many ways, the most creative and exciting developments in terms of the kinds of organizations that were being thrown up, the spirit of struggle and resistance, the new and unexpected ways that people found to resist, was exemplified in the most dramatic way in Latin America, and I'll speak about that in a minute. The other fronts, of course, were the resistance in the Middle East and the growing left in Europe. That was in 2005. My starting point today is to say that 5 years on, those new left radical governments have reached a point, a crossroads, in which the relationship with the movement that carried them to power is now problematic, open to question, and in many ways contradictory. But let me go back before I come back to the present, and just to remind ourselves of the circumstances in which the people we'll be discussing, people like Evo Morales, people like Hugo Chavez, people like Rafael Correa in Ecuador, the circumstances under which they emerged onto the world political scene. The 90s, really the turning point, I suppose, is marked by the Caracazo, the great insurrectionary upheaval, which lasted only a few days and left a death toll of several thousand, when the poor of Caracas rose up in outrage and rebellion against the imposition of the structural adjustment policies. I think that was the euphemism they were using then. Then it became the program, the program against poverty and so on. The structural adjustment programs imposed by the AMF on Venezuela, a newly elected president, a man of exemplary opportunism with an ability to turn in several different directions at once at any given moment in time, a man called Carlos Sanchez Perez, arrived into the presidency, marked his campaign by a declaration that he would never accept the restrictions and the strictures of the World Bank and the IMF, was elected to the presidency, and then 2 days later announced that, well, maybe he changed his mind and was now going to impose the strictures of the IMF and the World Bank full scale. The result was a mass insurrection of the values of the poor of Caracas, who flooded down into the streets. Now, as I say, it lasted 3 days and was crushed, but the important thing was it was in some ways a sign of things to come, not just in terms of resistance as such, but also the form that such resistance would take. And that's very important for us to remember that in understanding the present. The next 10 years were devastating for Latin America. They were the years of the imposition of the priorities of global capital, exemplified first of all in the North American Free Trade Association with its effective destruction of whole areas of state spending in Mexico, of the state sector, the privatization of massive sectors and of the state. This was reinforced and reproduced and repeated elsewhere in Latin America. Massive structural unemployment, the removal of subsidies, for example, to food and basic necessities, the removal of welfare programs, of unemployment subsidies across for 10 years. An assault which left levels of poverty far higher than had existed 10 years earlier, which left vast swathes of people migrating in search of work, which left the land open to the land-grabbing corporations and so on. That was the 90s, a period of terrible assaults on the living standards and conditions, on the lives of millions and millions of ordinary people in Latin America. The turning point was marked. Really, it was signaled before it began. In 1994, as we know, in Mexico, where the Zapatista movement really rose up, although it was later characterized as a movement which was about kind of indigenous traditions and so on, The origins of the Zapatista movement at the beginning of '94 were absolutely clear. It was a rising rebellion against the imposition of the North American Association, its rules, its regulations, and because the peasant indigenous farmers of distant Chiapas, distant from the centers of power in Mexico, were nevertheless affected directly by the World Trade Organization's removal of tariffs, by the removal of subsidies. They were maize farmers who could not compete with the maize industry's production of great corn plantations in North America, who could not afford to continue to grow maize, and who found that their basic food subsidies which they had received from the government were simply removed. It was a rebellion and outrage and despair. But it was very interesting that, of course, this was the first of, if you like, the great rebellions of Latin America. The reason I want to go back to it is not just to mark it as a historical moment, but also to underline something which I think is extremely important, which is to understand how that rebellion was characterized and explained politically in the years to come. Because when the World Social Forum movement began in 1999, and locked in with the rebellions that were then to happen in Argentina and Bolivia, the incredible political authority of the Zapatista movement gave credibility and great authority to the way in which the Zapatistas described the rebellion as specifically not an assault on power. You know, the Zapatistas described, and John Holloway, who was with us here, I'm very glad that the communist is here with us at Marxism over this weekend. John Holloway, in a very important and very famous book, really speaking with the voice of the Zapatistas, described the policy as one of changing the world without taking power. Now, in a sense, that corresponded to a reality, which was the serious decline of the left, the disorganization of the left, the disorientation of the left through the 90s in the face of the attacks of globalization. So in a sense, which was a real circumstance became a virtue. The inability to propose a strategy for the seizure of power in the late 90s became, in a sense, a quality. It was represented as a way of ensuring the avoidance of the corruptions associated with taking state power. And that was something which was taken up by the movement as an important and slogan which we should recognize as very important. That was in a sense the precedent. Then came 1999, the great rebellions, the beginnings of the fight back. In Ecuador in 1999 and 2000, with a very impressive record, the Ecuadorians removed one president and then went on to remove two more. The Bolivians, seeing that the Ecuadorians had moved three, obviously then went on to attempt to remove four and have competitive president overthrowing competition. But then came Cochabamba. Cochabamba, the rising of the city of Cochabamba and surrounding districts when the Bolivian government privatized water. Now, you could argue that it was very simple. For most of the people of Cochabamba, the prices proposed for water by Bechtel, to whom Cochabamba water had been sold, would have been so high as to make it impossible for most of the population to survive. So they rebelled, fought back, and in 3 weeks of dramatic confrontations, occupation of the city, the policy of privatization was reversed, and the Cochabamba water supply was then reverted to public control. It was a tremendously important and dramatic moment, perhaps more well known, undeservedly so, than the movement in Ecuador, which 1999 to 2000 resisted and rejected an attempt to incorporate the Ecuadorian economy into the global economy more directly. It was followed by other insurrectionary acts of rebellion, the Argentinazo, the great rising at the end of 2001, when the world financial system penalized Argentina by removing all forms of subsidy, and in fact drove the very developed Argentine economy to the verge of total collapse. We know then that there was a massive wave of resistance under the slogan, let's get rid of them all, que se vayan todos, a slogan which I'm sure we could all very, very easily agree with. The hell with a lot of them, I suppose, would be the equivalent. Well, that's all very well, but after they have left, what remains is a vacuum, and then we have to fill it. So the political character of these insurrectionary movements, they followed in Bolivia, after just 2 years later in Bolivia, in El Alto, the great, extraordinary kind of indigenous city, just above La Paz, just over 1.25 million inhabitants, organized against a second attempt to sell off Bolivian water to a private corporation, this time the Suez Corporation, and again successfully resisted the attempt to privatize water. There were a series of strikes then, a series of acts of resistance in the course of those years. So in the period really between 2000 and 2005, what we see are massive popular acts of resistance. And in the course of those acts of resistance, and this is extremely important, I think, to underline, the emergence of new, creative, profoundly exciting forms of mass organization. In Bolivia, it was what was called the Cabildo Abierto, a kind of reference back to 17th century Spanish town meetings. But there was nothing 17th century about these meetings. They were acts of popular control, of mass democracy exercised in the squares of cities and towns across Bolivia. In other places, they were called the Asambleas del Pueblo, people's assemblies. And they brought together all manner of organizations in open, democratic forms, largely controlled at the grassroots by community organizations or federations and coordinations of community organizations. In Venezuela, which of course, in many ways is the kind of the standard bearer for this new movement, this new period, there is an interesting debate about at what point we can see the same phenomenon occurring in Venezuela. My argument would be, and has always been, that if we want to talk about the Bolivarian Revolution, as opposed to the election of Hugo Chavez in 1998, we want to talk about the Bolivarian Revolution, that is the moment at which the mass of the poor, of working people and peasants become the key actors in history, take the historical stage, then I think we would talk about 2002. On April the 11th, there was an attempted coup in Venezuela. The Chambers of Commerce, the army, the church, and other disreputable groups got together and conducted and led a coup against Chavez, arrested him and took him away to an island prison. And as we all know, those of us who have seen that wonderful documentary, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. Thankfully, it was televised. The revolution will be televised, and it was televised, and we saw these people toasting each other with champagne. And the head of the Venezuelan Chamber of Commerce, I've always loved this moment when he said, "Oh no, I couldn't possibly take power. Not me, surely not me." "All right then," he said, and then drew out of his pocket a pre-prepared presidential sash which he had made a month earlier in Madrid. Surely not me. I really am unaccustomed as I am to taking power. But anyway, as we know, that it was a very, very brief experience, because within 48 hours, Hugo Chavez had returned. And he had returned because the people had come down from the barrios again, had occupied the center of Caracas, and refused to move until their president was returned. And returned he was, and came to the balcony and announced that he was back, to cheers and so on. The right in Venezuela did not, however, give up, never have given up. Instead, they moved to a second and much more aggressive phase in their policy, their attempt to bring down Chavez, which was the bosses' strike of December 2002 and February 2003. Now, this was, I don't think, the world has really been entirely aware of how brutal and how aggressive it really was. A number of pickets outside oil refineries were burned alive. People were shot and killed. The attempt really was to break the Venezuelan economy by making oil production impossible and by closing every other productive facility. It failed because of the mass mobilization of workers, of ordinary people, of communities, of land workers across the country who kept transport going, who kept the shops open, who kept the plants producing, who kept the oil refineries going, although they came very, very close to collapsing. So in each of these instances, the mass of ordinary people seize the center of the historical stage and become the protagonists of history, the subjects of history. Now the question, and therefore when Hugo Chavez goes to Porto Alegre in 2005 and announces socialism in the 21st century, the implication, though it's actually not ever particularly clear, the implication is that he, as the most recognizable spokesman for a group of new politicians who have risen to power as the representatives, as the spokespeople for these mass movements from below. They include Chavez himself, a year later Evo Morales, who had been the leader of the coca farmers organization, but whose family had learned their traditions of struggle in the mines of Bolivia. Rafael Correa, an unlikely representative as a Harvard-trained economist, but nevertheless somebody who gave voice to the aspirations, to the discourse of popular power, of people's power, in a sense which corresponded to the logic of these movements. So they are brought to power by this movement from below. But politically, where are they? Politically, what's going on? You see, I return to this question of, how to change the world without taking power. That slogan, or a version of it, permeates all of these movements. And it's extremely problematic, because who then, as Marxists, as people trained to look at the world from the perspective of class, we might ask, well, who is the protagonist of history? Who is the subject of history? Which class is the subject of history? And the answer came in the form of a number of explanations and theories, all of which treated this subject of history as a shifting, dislocated, and changing subject, around which it would be very, very difficult to build a strategy. I would place, the whole theory about multitudes in that category. I would say that John Holloway and the Zapatistas' description of the movements as swarms, they're tremendously attractive and very evocative literary metaphors, but they're not helpful when we think in terms of a strategic development of strategies evolving over time and based on a clearly defined, self-aware group located clearly in the social and reproductive complex. So 2005 was the high point. Chavez was in power, and not only, let me just dwell for a moment on Venezuela in particular, because 2005 is a critical moment in Venezuela as well. Because until 2002, and it's a very interesting thing, that after the attempt at failed coup, Chavez's immediate response was not to build on the great wave of support in the streets, but instead to see that great crowd, that multitude, as a bargaining counter in returning to his discussions with private capital, with the bankers. The first meeting he had as he returned to the presidential palace was with Cisneros, the most powerful businessman in Venezuela, and a number of other business sectors. After 2003, with the radicalization of the assault of the right, there, in a sense, the most radical, the most creative period of Venezuela then occurs with the creation of what are called the missions. And the missions, in some ways, are attempts to create institutions of a parallel state. That is, institutions capable of driving forward the program that Chavez and others represented. For 2 years, they were important. They created incredibly exciting and impressive new education programs, for example, a new project for health called Barrio Dentro, which used Cuban doctors, a drive towards cooperatives and so on. But it's important to say that even at that stage, the general policy and the general project was one of the redistribution of oil wealth under a nationalized oil corporation, creating anti-poverty programs, cooperative programs, health programs, and education programs. But at no point, even in the most radical of constitutions, not in the current Ecuadorian constitution, not in the Bolivian constitution, which are in many ways very, very advanced and radical, and certainly not in the Venezuelan constitution, was it suggested that in order for the revolution to progress, there had to be major distribution of wealth, expropriation of capital. Not at all. This was an anti-neoliberal program. And therefore it was an anti-neoliberal program, it was anti-imperialist, and we have all of us been delighted by Chavez's regular insulting speeches against Bush and the United States and so on. Well-deserved and beautifully put. When he came to the United Nations, he came up, after Bush had spoken, came up to the desk and said, "Smells of sulfur around here." I earned him about 3 years of international support. Anyway, but the point is that the Constitution was radical, it was a radical reforming program. But it said it was something else. The discourse of this movement was a discourse of people's power, of popular power, of the devolution of power to the organizations that had been thrown up in the course of struggle, which would be the foundation of a new society. That was what was said in the discourse. But in the reality, while there were expropriations and nationalizations, they were always with full compensation, and they were invariably responses to specific circumstances: the attempt to close a factory, the bankruptcy of a factory owner, the persistent arguments by workers about their mistreatment and the failure to recognize trade union agreements, for example, as in the case of Sidor, the iron and steel foundry in Puerto Ordaz. All of these were there. So they were radical programs in their rhetoric. And they claimed quite directly they claimed their ascendancy from those mass popular movements. But they also claimed to be the protagonists of history. The new state, Chavez's state, the Bolivarian state, while it changed the name of the ministries from the Ministry of this and that to the Ministry for Popular Power of this and that, this was, I think, and we have to recognize it, a change in label, but not a change in the relationship between the state and the mass movement. On the contrary, 5 years on, what we see in Venezuela and in Bolivia are very disturbing signs that where the state claimed to be, as it were, the representative, the direct voice of the mass of people, it has become more and more disengaged from that mass of ordinary people, from that mass movement, and on the contrary, has sought new ways to control that mass movement from above. And, let's face it, to limit its activities and to limit its protagonism. Now, it's partly because the movement itself did not think strategically. It thought in terms of response and reaction, of mobilizing around great traditions, indigenous traditions, and so on, but without a corresponding understanding of what kind of power, what kind of state, what kind of social organization, towards what kind of social organization did the logic of mass organization from below lead. Now, in this context, in a sense, we have, albeit at the level of definition, we at least have an understanding of where that leads. It leads to the self-emancipation of workers. It leads to socialism from below. Such a simple slogan, such a complex idea, but that's where it leads. So in Venezuela today, and here one has to address the problem that today the state set up out of the Bolivarian Revolution is the state whose structures remain, despite their name, very much the same as the prior state, and have inherited not only its structures, but also its corruptions. Today, the Venezuelan state, headed by Chavez, is a state which is riven with corruption of the most, really to a very high degree. The best and most honest and most committed people have one by one been removed. The latest was a man, the Minister of Consumer Affairs, a man called Eduardo Saman, who, as for all that one can see, was absolutely honest, took on the suppliers and the distributors of food and drink, and was removed. And it's never been clear why. It's true that some ministers, among them Jesse Chacon, has been removed, really because they were so blatant in their corruption. I mean, Jesse Chacon put it rather in to run the state bank. You know, I mean, come on, you know, if you're going to be corrupt, at least attempt to conceal it. Alejandro Sanchez and others. But the key figures, the figures who really run the machine and the apparatus, particularly the Minister for Infrastructure, which is a wonderful job to have if you have to be as corrupt as Giordano Cabello, a wonderful job to have. And then they make him Minister of Public Works, just in case they left a bit out. These people are running the state. More importantly, in 2006, faced with the enormous confusion of the left and the mass movement in Venezuela, Chavez announced the creation of a new political party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela. It was celebrated as an instrument for people's democracy and popular power. It has instead been an instrument for the imposition of a new apparatus of power and for establishing incredible restraint on some of the extraordinary and wonderful and competent comrades who on the ground have carried this revolution to the point it's reached now. In Bolivia, in a sense, we see a very similar situation where the great mass movements based often on indigenous traditions, which is fine, and we have to learn to understand the content and nature of those traditions, their democratic content, if we are to work with them and in them. That's something which the Bolivian left has had terrible trouble doing.
We have to learn to live within them. But in a sense, when it came to the question of how to run a state, the movement had no strategy and rested back on an existing social democratic organization, the MAS, which the movement towards socialism, which Morales then joined, and for which he became the presidential candidate. That was enormously significant, I think. But when it came to the Constitutional Conference to elaborate the new Bolivian constitution, with Morales' approval, the decision was taken that only political parties would be represented at that conference, and not movements without a specific political expression. That very largely excluded the reality of the mass movements. Now today, 2010, in the middle of 2010, the cracks are beginning to show. Correa in Ecuador, whose recent constitution was rightly celebrated as one of the most radical constitutions in the world, recognizing all sorts of multicultural rights and so on and so forth, recognizing the rights of earth. The problem with constitutions is that they have to be enacted, defended, and fought for. Otherwise, they are not worth the paper they're written on. And they are being fought for by the indigenous organizations, for example, who are now resisting the decisions by the government of Ecuador, by Rafael Correa, to allow rights, contractual rights, to multinational corporations over oil, subsoil, and water rights in the indigenous areas of Ecuador. There are now battles going on every day. Of course, they're going on in Peru too, against the arch-reactionary Alan Garcia. But these are the same battles. Last week, there was a major demonstration in Bolivia against the government of Evo Morales over the question of the imposition of a maximum level of wage increases. An argument which is not simply about whether it should be 5% or 6%, but is actually an argument that's been going on for several years about whether workers have the right to ensure that their wages run in parallel with the rising cost of living. And although Bolivia very proudly has announced that it's paid off, that it has the largest reserves in Latin America, it remains the fact that a very large proportion of the population remain in poverty and that the levels of life of most workers have not risen significantly. We go back. So what we face then is a moment in which if you like, the radical states have enacted radical programs of welfare reform, have redistributed through new taxation and so on, redistributed increases in wealth, in welfare programs, anti-poverty programs, and the rest. But it remains the case, and I know this may be controversial, but it's simply the truth that we have to face. It remains the case that in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, the leaders, if you like, in this radical new left of Latin America, private capital remains powerful, protected, and extremely profitable. And that all the arguments about change have avoided the fundamental structural questions of redistribution of income and expropriation of capital. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, we have to recognize too that 2010 is also a moment in which there is a resurgence of the right in Latin America. In some ways, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that the great upsurge in struggle and successive struggles in the last 10 years have been because of the weakness of imperialism. Perhaps it's been distracted elsewhere. Who knows? Perhaps the struggles in the Middle East didn't leave it time to take on Venezuela. But it is the truth that sadly, under the government of Barack Obama, there has been a coup in Honduras led by the worst and most reactionary elements who conducted the savage a war in Central America through the 1980s, people like Otto Reich and John Negroponte. Well, they're back. And they're back organizing a coup in Honduras, presumably because Honduras wasn't very important, maybe people wouldn't notice. But it isn't a significant country, except it was significant enough in the 80s to be turned into an American military base from which to launch the assault on Sandinista Nicaragua. And today in Honduras, there are murders every day. Last week, the leader of the teachers' union was murdered. There is repression, there is brutality under the new government of Honduras. And Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton prevaricated to allow the consolidation of this new regime, advised by those closest to them their closest advisors on questions of Central America, namely John Negroponte, who then went on to even greater glory in Iraq, Otto Reich, the man who has orchestrated any number of coups and who was a friend and ally of most of the military regimes in Latin America through the 80s and 90s, and a man called John McCain, who welcomed the coup makers in Honduras as the chairman of the Republican Foreign Affairs Committee, and of course there's the other person who's rather keen on Honduras, and John Negroponte, who's Hillary Clinton. But more importantly than that, the sign was in a speech that Barack Obama made before he retained the presidency. And he made a speech a couple of months before he won the presidency in which he asked the question, are we losing Latin America? That was his phrase, are we losing Latin America? The answer to that comes in the Honduran coup, and don't underestimate the significance of the Honduran coup. It comes in the construction of 7 new military bases in Colombia. It comes in the recent victory of Piñera in Chile. It would be almost impossible to think of anybody to the right of Piñera, who is now the replacement as Chilean president of Michelle Bachelet, who at least had some human rights credentials, and has now been replaced by the richest businessman in Chile. So there is a resurgence of the right. There is a clearly orchestrated, developing right-wing consensus to stop them, and to stop the empire, stop the United States from losing Latin America. And in that they have some perhaps tragically unexpected allies. Certainly in terms of the economy, they have an ally in Lula, who immediately after his access to power announced to those who had supported him that he would not be recognising the pension rights of civil servants, he would not be recognising the demands of the landless workers movement, but instead Brazil would become a major player on the world stage, right, by developing biofuels industry and by sending its troops to Haiti. Enough said. So economically, what the attempt by Venezuela and Bolivia and the others to create a kind of integrated bloc with all the rhetoric of Pan-Americanism and Bolivarianism is within the logic of capitalism, of capitalist competition, creating strong economic blocs in order to compete on the world market. They do not, these blocs, these coordinations, these plans, do not represent a challenge to capitalism itself. So a resurgent right, a state which in a sense has reached its limits in terms of developing what Evo Morales, vice president, was very, very, very clear about. Garcia Linera was asked, and has been repeatedly asked, what is the strategy of the Bolivian state? And he answers, the creation of Andean capitalism. That's what he's clear about. So what do we say now to the movement? What should our debates be with the movement below? And the movement below, in a sense, has been, I think, almost paralysed by its relationship with the leaders. And today, there is an urgent task for socialists in Latin America and for all those of us who see ourselves as part of the great international debate, as engaged with seeking ways and helping to develop the movement, the revolutionary movement in Latin America. And that is to, as it were, to refill the idea of popular power with real content. Wherever possible, to rebuild the movements, the independent movements of the class. Of course they will defend Morales. Of course they will defend Chavez. Of course they will defend Correa. But they must also have the capacity to act, to drive the revolution beyond them when the time comes.